Welcome to the HRchat podcast, bringing the best of the HR, talent, and leadership communities to you. For more episodes and the latest articles covering what's new in the world of work, visit hrgazette.com, subscribe and follow us on social media.
Welcome to another episode of the HR Chat Show. I'm your host today, Bill Banham. And in this episode, we're going to ask, why is the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging more important than ever? And how can HR pros and leaders get it right? My awesome guest today is Jennifer Morris, an expert in the fields of diversity, inclusion, leadership, and talent development. And she works with a wide range of clients, helping them to understand the value of diverse talent and then designing and implementing strategies to achieve that. Jen's research and writing has been published by Forbes, HR Magazine, HR Director Magazine, the International Labour Organization, Business Disability Forum, Fairplay Talks, and Diversity Q. All sound great, but they're not the HR Gazette. But don't worry, we're fixing that today. Hey, Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's great to be here.
So, Jen, beyond my wee introduction there, why don't you start by taking a minute or two and introducing yourself to our audience and telling them a wee bit about your career background?
Perfect. Thank you. So dialing back many years now, I undertook an undergraduate degree focusing on business and HR, and I wrote my undergraduate research in equal opportunities, as it was called then. And I think that lit a bit of a fire in my belly back then, and actually then that became a real focus on my whole career, both in-house. So I worked for 20 years in-house in organizations and held a number of global diversity and inclusion roles. And then since sort of finishing my in-house career, I've worked, as you said, with lots of different clients in lots of different industries in the UK, globally, really just helping them bring to life intersectional inclusion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now then, you're a chartered fellow of the CIPD. And for our audience in the US and Canada, I wondered perhaps if you can talk a little bit about that organization, the CIPD, the work that they do to improve the HR field in the UK and elsewhere.
Yes, certainly. So the CIPD is the professional body, the professional organisation for HR and people development. It's a UK-based organisation, but they do have global members, about 160,000 members around the world. And they have a purpose, which is championing better work and working lives. So this is an organisation that I've been a part of and became qualified with, because frankly, who can argue with that as an objective? And certainly in the world that I now work in and focus on in diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging, having better work and better working lives is absolutely core to that.
Excellent, thank you. I know that on another pod that I'm involved with for hrreview.co.uk, they have featured folk from the CIPD. I've had folk on this show from the HRPA, which is the Canadian equivalent, and SHRM, of course, which is in the US, but I'm yet to have anybody from the CIPD. So if you're listening, CIPD folks, give me a call. Let's have a chat. Hey, Jen, now I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about HALT EF and how it helps HR pros and leaders.
Absolutely. So HALT EF Corporate Education helps organisations and leaders develop critical skills, attitudes and behaviours that they need to be fit for the future. And frankly, we all look into the future and it's becoming vastly more ambiguous and complex than perhaps it was certainly at the beginning of my career. So it's really helpful, I think, to people in their practical day-to-day work in HR, so HR professionals, but also the leaders and the managers and the talented future leaders that come through organisations to help them get ready for that. I think particularly in the fields that we're talking about today, so in diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging, they have leadership development programs which focus and emphasise those skills particularly. So things around inclusive leadership, inclusive behaviour, psychological safety, how to create cultures of belonging, and also through using diverse pools of executive coaches to support people in really being able to cope with the unique challenges that leaders face.
The days of matching web keyword searches with resumes and job descriptions is over. It's all about cultural fit. WorkZinga empowers job seekers looking for jobs.
and employers looking for new hires to have thoughtful and insightful conversations, making the recruiting process more successful for both sides. Learn more at workzinger.com.
This word belonging, Jen, why is that important? On this show, we often refer to the acronym DEI, not necessarily DEIB. Why do you guys focus so much on the B, on the belonging?
I love this question. So this is, I completely empathise, because actually the acronym and the language of this field has changed so much and continues to evolve. But actually the emphasis on belonging is really as an outcome and as an end goal and sort of the holy grail, if you like, of DEI. So just to kind of quickly step through what each of those mean. So diversity is really the facts about us. So those are our characteristics, our lived experience, our identities, both things that we're born with, things that are inherent to us, and things that we acquire over our lifetime. Equity is really about a choice in the process that we take in organisations, so that we're actually going to create equality and fairness. Inclusion is in our behaviour, so it's the way that we speak and act, the things that we do. So it's really choiceful, a really active word. And then belonging is the outcome, it's the result of those things. And actually, in the report that we're going to be talking about a little bit, belonging is in the centre of the Venn diagram. So actually, it's at the heart of those other three elements coming together as the result.
Love that answer. Thank you very much. And you mentioned just a second ago that there is a report that we're going to talk about, and we're going to do that right now. In fact, you've recently worked with Holt EF on creating a new report, DEIB in Action. Take some time now, Jen, please, and tell us a little bit about the report.
Fantastic, thank you. So the purpose of this report is really to provide strategies to inspire and embed change in organisations in this arena. So it will guide leaders and enable them to turn ideas and thoughts actually into action to create results. It's been a really fantastic thing to work on, because it pulls together, as you would expect, best practice from recent research carried out by Holt EF subject matter experts. So the real theory behind it, that kind of that underpinning of research, and then it talks also about the combined perspectives of global industry figures, so people who work in this field, who lead in it, who actually have had to do this in their own organizations. So it brings together then that, well, so what? How do we bring this to life? How do we take it into action? And how do we get great results in DEIB?
The Jovio platform enables businesses to buy, manage, and track recruitment media. This includes job sites, social, and search marketplaces to attract and hire the most relevant applicants on time and within their budget. Powering more than 20 million jobs every day, our data-driven recruitment advertising platform uses advanced data science and machine learning to dynamically manage and optimize talent sourcing and applications across all online channels, while providing real-time insights at every step of the job seeker journey. Learn more at jovio.com.
Excellent. And I will be asking you before we wrap up today how our listeners can find that report. And of course, there will be a link in the show notes, listeners, but we'll get to that in a little while. Okay, so we're living through somewhat interesting times at the moment, Jen. And certainly for the UK, the economic forecast isn't looking fantastic for the next 4 to 5 quarters. And you might say, well, perhaps the emphasis in 2023 in the UK and several other countries is going to be more on just keeping one's job, not being laid off. Why would you say, however, that the business case for DEIB is more vital now than ever before, and it shouldn't be put to one side?
God, great question. So dialing back again, kind of right back to the beginning of my career, the emphasis in this field was very much about legality. It was about there's protective legislation in place, and good looks like not falling foul of that. There was also an element of social equity, so this sense of this is the right thing to do, so this is why we might focus on that. You dial forward to where we are now, and we now have really clear and compelling research which shows that there is there are a whole range of commercial benefits of DEIB. Those range from things like creativity, innovation, increased agility, so that the ability of teams to pivot. They also evidence that actually we're better collectively as diverse thinkers at horizon scanning for risk and then managing that risk. So there are a number of commercial reasons why the combination of diversity, so diversity of thought, diversity of characteristic, and an inclusive culture that unlocks the potential of that, actually creates good business outcomes. Now, as you say, with any kind of backdrop, particularly sort of a volatile economic backdrop, there is a real laser focus in organisations about what's going to get us through this, how are we going to survive as well as thrive. And actually having the ability to innovate, to be creative, to manage risk are all really important factors in navigating that. I would also say as well that it's particularly important that we don't lose our focus on DEIB, despite the fact that there is this kind of external volatility and complexity to navigate, because the things that have been achieved in DEIB are not given. They are not sort of in the bank and done. So we think about, maybe we've got to a certain point of social equity and we can't possibly go back from that. We can. Actually, this isn't a linear and progressive journey. It doesn't just go in one direction. Actually, legislation and attitudes and cultures change over time, and people's rights and the inclusion they might feel in an organization can still be eroded. We can lose what we've already gained. So I think that's why we need to not keep our we need to keep our eye on the ball with this one, and not get distracted and not think about this as something that isn't critical to business success, because it is.
Okay, so I get it, Jen. DEIB is vital. It's terribly important. It's also pretty tough to get right. Is that correct?
It is. It certainly is. And over the time that I've worked with now sort of hundreds of different organisations, there are things that noticed over time are the kind of commonly occurring reasons why this is so challenging. And I've got three that I'd love to share. There's sort of my convenient buckets that I have in my mind of what's going on here and why is this so difficult. The first one is that DEIB is complex, and in organizations we all like a clear answer and a simple solution and a silver bullet that's going to kind of fix problems, but in this arena there's really no single problem, and there's no single solution that will kind of create an easy route forward for any one problem either. So every organization basically encounters their own set of challenges in DEIB, and the initiatives or the approaches that certain organizations take won't necessarily be helpful or fix the problem in another organization. So it's not as simple as a kind of a lift and drop. It's not as simple as patching something in technology. It's actually really complex because it's part of the human dynamic. So that complexity is really difficult to pick apart for organizations to understand, well, what are the opportunities for us here and what are the risks? DEIB can also be controversial, and I would say that increasingly, certainly over the period of my career, it's just getting more and more so. Organizations are now being held publicly accountable for their so-called successes and failures in this field. So it becomes quite difficult for organizations to think, well, we'll just experiment with this and see if it works, or we'll just begin and try to see if we can make some improvements, because actually they're really being held to account. historically, this accountability often came, as I said, from legislation. So actually, there were some guardrails in place, and as long as we stayed within them, we were likely to be okay. But I would say that increasingly it's members of the public and customers and activists, both employee activists and kind of social activists, who are more and more vocal about what organisations are doing or what they're not doing. So actually, it's not an option just to do nothing, because you'll get called out for that too. So there has this controversy wrapped around it. And finally, DEIB is emotive, because we are talking about our characteristics, our identities, our lived experience. It's highly personal and sensitive territory for people to talk about. And because of that, because we're all unique in those experiences, employees have a spectrum of opinions, and that's what organizations are trying to navigate, this spectrum of opinions. From, at one end, people thinking we should be doing way more in DEIB than we are, to the other end of the spectrum where people are saying this has got nothing to do with work, why are you asking me about my characteristics? So, and everything in between. So organizations are having to go through that emotive territory when they're trying to get strategies in place.
Okay, Jen, so I get it, and I'm sure lots of leaders and HR pros listening out there today get it too now. But before we ask you to maybe offer a few practical tips that organizations can take on their own DEIB journeys, let's talk a little bit about what can go wrong, shall we? What common pitfalls do you see coming up when organizations are getting started on their DEIB journey?
So I think there's something that's peculiar to this point in time, which is that if organizations are starting out now, they are looking over their shoulders at what other organizations have already done. And I think they feel that they're behind. They've got behind the curve. So a common pitfall is actually that the organizations panic. They think there's this big thing called DEIB and we need to do something about it, but we don't know what. So they kind of rush into it without sufficiently defining their why. And often when I'm working with organizations, I kind of talk about the range of whys. So why is this important in organizations? What are all the various business cases that there can be why we should all think seriously about this and be considered? But actually, the right answer to that is the right answer for that organization. It's their why, it's not someone else's. And actually, I think organizations can rush through that careful consideration and definition of what that is. I've seen organizations, for example, spend more time and money thinking about how they're going to brand their DEIB efforts and what should the strapline be, and what kind of lanyards should we have printed, because we want to have rainbow lanyards. Organizations get into that detail without really thinking about what is authentic to our business about this. I think another common pitfall is that organizations see other companies doing things and they pick up and drop those initiatives without having clear intention. So they think, oh, there's some shiny, sparkly solution over there, and I'll pick it up and I'll drop it into my organization with an expectation that it's going to fix things or create opportunities in DEIB. And then it doesn't quite work, it doesn't quite fit. And I also think that organizations can be quite a common pitfall is they can be quite scattergun. So it's just sort of like, let's just do loads of activity without, again, being really focused about what they're trying to achieve. And I want to just say that I know this sounds quite negative, and I'm not saying any of that with the intention of judgment at all, because this is a really complex field, as I've already talked about, and as certainly is brought to life in the report that we're sharing. It's really just, I'm sharing those things as common pitfalls so that we can then be thoughtful and step over those pitfalls rather than falling into them.
Well, absolutely, and I completely agree with you. In fact, I've spoken to many leaders on this show who certainly certainly when we're not recording, they have admitted to me that while they've put DEIB initiatives in place, the budgets for those efforts are still sitting there and they're not being spent because there's still lots of head scratching and so on. And that's pretty disappointing. A couple of years on from the death of George Floyd, for example, and companies are still getting their act together. That's pretty sad. Anyway, this is not me answering questions, it's you answering questions. So let's go back to you. Okay, so those are the pitfalls. Let's as we look to wrap up today's interview, what are some of the practical actions, some of your top tips that organizations can take and excel with their DEIB efforts?
Fantastic. So I always have a really pragmatic mindset, particularly having worked in-house myself, and I love to get to the so what. So here we are. The first is with some light plagiarism of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, start with the end in mind. So take the time to think as an organization about what's our authentic why does this matter to us, and what does good look like. So if we're talking about in 3 years' time, we aspire to X, Y, and Z. What does that look like? How will we know we've got there? And, what measures can we put in place so that we know we're going to achieve our aspiration? So start with the end in mind is the first one. I think then moving back from that, it's creating really targeted, intentional plans about how you're going to get from where you are at the start line to your 3-year aspiration, to your end line. So rather than just picking up lots of different shiny things and putting them in place, actually being really planful and intentional. And I would say that being able to do that means that you do have to have that infrastructure in place around DEIB. So, exactly as you say, you do need to have budget in place. You do need it to be resourced with people who can bring this to life and with professional expertise. Now, I would say that, obviously, being being a professional in this field, I would say that that's important. But I also think that can be a bit of a pitfall for organizations because they can depend on people volunteering their time, which always then puts DEIB on the side of someone's desk. Actually, this needs to be led by people for whom this is a really serious focus. I would also then say, once we've got our end in mind and we know the steps we need to take from where we're journeying, where we're starting from to our end goal, we then need to bring people with us. And I think particularly in 2 ways this is important. We need to focus carefully on communication. And if organizations are clear about what DEIB means to them, that means that they can communicate really clearly and compellingly with their teams, with their colleagues over time. And the second way that we need to bring people along is to educate them. We need to help people with this. It is difficult, it's hard to navigate, and it's fearful for people, which then means that we stop talking about it because we're too scared about getting it wrong. So we need to educate our leaders in inclusive leadership so they understand what that is, to role model it and to do it. And we need to educate colleagues in what belonging looks like, what psychological safety is, and actually what inclusive colleague behaviour is. So those are the steps that I would recommend and the practical actions that I think lots of organisations adopt when they do this well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. Jen, I was just about to ask you my final question about learning more and about the action report and things, but you mentioned something there that I just have to pick up on. You mentioned that often organizations rely on essentially volunteers. So I'd love to get your take on the role of ERGs, employee resource groups, in strategizing and implementing these sorts of initiatives. Are they useful? Do they actually hinder the process because they slow it down? These are often voluntary groups, but where do you sit on ERGs?
Yeah, I think they can be incredibly useful. I think they can be powerhouses, actually. And I don't just mean that in terms of, resource, so hands on deck of people who are prepared to do things. But I also think in terms of genuine lived experience and insight into particular characteristics, identities, or historically discriminated against or marginalized groups. It really enables organizations to listen up to those experiences, and again, where you have a really good and strong relationship with ERGs in organisations, to actually then propose, well, how do we do this better? They can be used and be part of a really constructive organisational and cultural development. What's really critical is, again, that they are set up well. So there's a clear framework of how are we going to work together? What's everyone's mandate here? And what's the accountability that we have? And then that they are resourced to actually take action. So something that can be very frustrating for ERGs and then for organisations wrapping around them is when they really don't have a clear mandate that they're able to do things, to really constructively do things, because then it just turns into a whole lot of talking and not enough walking. And that's what's really helpful about ERGs, is that they can be real powerhouses of activity.
I think I've just found my subtitle for this podcast episode: a whole lot of talking and not enough walking. Love it. Okay. Jen, before we wrap up for today, perhaps you can tell our listeners how they can connect with you. So maybe that's through LinkedIn. Maybe you want to share your email address. Maybe you're super cool and you're all over TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, places like that.
Also, so absolutely love to connect with people on LinkedIn, Jennifer Morris, and also you can email me directly, jennifer.morris@ef.com.
Beautiful. And what about Holt EF, and of course the Holt EF DEIB in action report? How can they learn more about the company and the report?
So I can just give you the landing page, which again, I imagine you'll include in the notes. So holtef.com/DEIB, and the white paper will be downloadable there, and also lots of other information about the ways in which Holt EF can support people and organisations with DEIB. So again, the things that I alluded to, so leadership development work, diverse pools of executive coaches, language training solutions, all of that information will be there too.
Excellent. And by the way, listeners, outside of the main recording today, I did comment to Jen that she's got an amazing voice and she should totally do more podcasts. So I think you should pursue that. And if I can help in any way, Jen, do let me know. But that just
Thank you so much. I don't want to be
good.
accused of too much talking, though, and not enough walking.
That's a great place to leave this conversation for today. So I'm just going to say to you, Jen, thank you so much for being my guest on this episode of the HR Chat Show.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And listeners, as always, until next time, happy working.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the HR Chat podcast. There are hundreds of conversations with business experts available for free on the HR Gazette website, Apple, Spotify, and all the main platforms. And remember to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media.